How the Arab Spring started and how it affected the world. The anti-government protests and uprisings known as the Arab Spring, which started in late 2010 and spread throughout the Arab world, represented a dramatic shift in the political climate of the area. These movements sought to demand democratic reforms and more freedoms. They were spurred by popular discontent with authoritarian government, economic hardship, and social inequities. In this video, we will highlight 7 key points outlining how the Arab Spring started and its impact on the world. Number 7. Origin in Tunisia. Tunisia, a nation that had long struggled with socioeconomic issues and political persecution, was the birthplace of the Arab Spring, when 26-year-old street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire on December 17, 2010 in protest at police harassment and the confiscation of his products. He became the impetus for change. His desperate gesture brought to light the widespread problems that many Tunisians faced, including unemployment, corruption, and a lack of chances. Bouazizi's untimely death struck a profound chord with the public, sparking nationwide protests. Chanting demands for dignity, freedom, and an end to Ben Ali's repressive administration, protesters marched to the streets. The demonstrations swiftly gained momentum and scale, attracting people from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds, including professionals, laborers, and students. Initial attempts by the administration to use violence to put an end to the turmoil only served to incite more resentment and mobilization. A major win for the Tunisian people occurred on January 14, 2011, when President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia following weeks of intensifying protests and mounting international pressure. This great revolution not only changed Tunisia but also sparked similar uprisings throughout the Arab East, proving that popular resistance could topple long-standing authoritarian governments. Number 6. Spread across the region. The triumph of the Tunisian Revolution served as a potent impetus for revolutions across the Arab world, exposing a common yearning for social justice and political change among people in different nations. In this process, social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter became indispensable instruments for activists to plan demonstrations, disseminate information, and elevate their voices. On January 25, 2011, massive protests broke out in Egypt, following the example set by Tunisia. In order to urge an end to President Hosni Mubarak's nearly 3-decade rule, millions of Egyptians assembled in Tahrir Square. As Libyans attempted to topple Muammar Gaddafi's 40-year tyranny, nonviolent protests against him soon descended into violent altercations. The upheavals also extended to Yemen and Bahrain, where protesters with long-standing complaints against autocratic leadership demanded greater freedoms and democratic reforms. These movements were interrelated, showing a greater regional dissatisfaction with autocratic rule and stagnant economic growth. The Arab Spring demonstrated the strength of mass mobilization against repressive governments and the ability of contemporary communication platforms to enable collective action. Number 5. Key events in Egypt. Tahrir Square became a famous symbol of protest against dictatorship, and Egypt emerged as one of the key Arab Spring battlegrounds. Driven by widespread issues like poverty, political repression, and police brutality, the protests started on January 25, 2011. Millions congregated in Tahrir Square throughout the course of the next 18 days, despite brutal crackdowns by security forces who used rubber bullets and tear gas to disperse crowds. The demonstrators' tenacity attracted attention from around the world, and pictures of their bravery were shared on social media, inspiring support for their cause. President Mubarak resigned from office on February 11th, following intense pressure from both local upheaval and international censure, particularly from Western nations. This event was widely observed throughout the region, not simply in Egypt, as evidence of the effectiveness of people mobilization against oppression. The aftermath, however, was turbulent. While Egypt held its first free elections in June 2012, which resulted in the election of Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohamed Morsi, political division between secular and Islamist factions grew. Significant obstacles to Morsi's presidency included a shaky economy and growing popular unhappiness over his alleged authoritarian tendencies. Number 4. Civil wars and violence. After their revolutions, some nations underwent comparatively calm transitions or reforms, while others descended into years-long chaos and violence. Protests against Gaddafi's dictatorship in Libya quickly turned into a bloody civil war between several factions fighting for control of the country's resources and territory. Under a UN authorization, NATO launched a military intervention in March 2011 with the intention of safeguarding civilians. Nevertheless, once Gaddafi was toppled and murdered in October 2011, this involvement unintentionally led to additional instability. Rival militias and political factions began fighting after Gaddafi's demise, and the conflict is still going on today. Peaceful protests against President Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria gave way to a full-scale civil war by mid-2011 as a result of violent repression that included widespread arrests and protester deaths at the hands of security forces. Numerous regional and international actors that backed opposing sides were drawn into the conflict, which resulted in a humanitarian crisis marked by massive atrocities carried out by both rebel and government forces. Millions of people were internally displaced, where they fled as refugees to neighboring nations or Europe in search of protection from persecution and bloodshed. Number 3. Impact on governance. Many countries had high aspirations for democratic reforms during the initial wave of optimism surrounding the Arab Spring, but due to varying political settings and historical legacies, the results differed greatly amongst countries. Considering its turbulent past under Ben Ali's rule, Tunisia's adoption of a new constitution in January 2014 that placed an emphasis on civil freedoms, gender equality, and political pluralism allowed it to traverse its transition quite effectively in comparison to its neighbors. In contrast, Egypt's post-Mubarak political landscape was turbulent, with the military overthrowing President Morsi in a coup in July 2013 following widespread protests against his rule that erupted once more as a result of economic hardships and concerns about growing authoritarianism under his rule. This resulted in heightened persecution under the military dictatorship of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, which severely clamped down on dissent by enforcing legislation that targeted civil society groups and mass accounting opposition politicians and activists. After President Ali Abdullah Saleh was overthrown in early 2012, other countries like Yemen experienced protracted instability and continued conflict between rival factions fighting for control. This has led to one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the history of the globe. Number 2. Global repercussions. Beyond specific countries, the Arab Spring had a significant impact on international discourse on democracy and human rights, as well as how the world saw the Middle East and North Africa. The upheavals brought to light concerns like gender inequality and youth unemployment, which were particularly prominent among educated youth, which struck a chord with activists fighting for social justice in a variety of contexts across the globe. Western governments were faced with difficult decisions about how to balance their commitment to advancing democratic values abroad with their past support of authoritarian regimes. Western governments were faced with difficult decisions about how to balance their commitment to advancing democratic values abroad with their historical support of authoritarian regimes. This tension was highlighted in discussions about foreign intervention, where some claimed that outside assistance was necessary to promote democratic change, while others criticized it as meddling that could worsen existing conflicts or destabilize local movements seeking true reform free from outside influence or ulterior motives. Number 1. Long-term consequences. The long-term effects of the Arab Spring are still unclear. While many other countries have struggled with increased repression or ongoing conflicts since their uprisings began more than 10 years ago, Tunisia has made notable progress toward democratic governance marked by regular free elections held since then, along with constitutional reforms emphasizing human rights protections. The civil war in Syria alone has not stopped, wreaking havoc on civilian lives, causing not only great suffering, but also destabilizing neighboring countries. This has contributed significantly to one of the worst refugee crises in history, affecting Europe as millions of people have fled their homes in search of safety from persecution or violence back home. More than 6 million Syrians have fled since the conflict began. Furthermore, throughout this turbulent period, extremist groups such as ISIS took advantage of the confusion created by these conflicts to gain territory and influence in both Syria and Iraq, further complicating attempts towards peace and reconstruction in post-conflict scenarios that impacted states still confront today. In the end, the Arab Spring was both a bright hope for the change that many had long yearned for and a sobering reminder of the difficulties in bringing about long-lasting political reform within deeply ingrained systems of power that are corrupt and frequently resist change, even though the public has been calling for it continuously over time and even now. The continued effects of these revolutions serve as a constant reminder of the ongoing fight for justice and human rights and continue to have an impact on regional politics and perceptions of democracy around the world. Thanks for watching our video, and don't forget to subscribe.